It was a hot, lazy Sunday at Sammamish State Park, just outside Seattle. The beach hummed with energy, laughter, chatter, and the carefree joy of a perfect summer day. It was the kind of afternoon that felt untouchable, where nothing could possibly go wrong. But beneath the surface, danger prowled. No one had the slightest idea that a predator moved silently among them. Amid the crowd, Ted Bundy moved unnoticed. His tan Volkswagen Beetle parked just a stone's throw away. With his arm in a sling and a warm, disarming smile, he approached woman after woman, asking for help loading a sailboat onto his car. Most offered polite refusals, but there was something about him, something harmless, even vulnerable, that made it difficult to refuse. And then he succeeded. Janice Ott, a young social worker, was the first to fall for his ruse. Witnesses saw her willingly walk away with him, unaware of the nightmare that awaited. Later that afternoon, Denise Naslund, a 19-year-old student, vanished in the same way. Two women abducted in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, yet no one suspected a thing. It was unthinkable, but Bundy's calm demeanor and unsettling confidence worked like a spell. Several witnesses would later recall hearing him introduce himself casually as Ted, a clue that would become crucial in linking him to the crimes. The Lake Sammamish abductions marked a critical turning point. By then, Bundy had already killed at least 6 women, though he would later claim the number was far higher. But this time, he left something behind: a trail. For the first time, Bundy had caught the attention of authorities. Eyewitness accounts led to a composite sketch, a crucial break in the case. It spread quickly, generating a flood of tips from across the state, including one from Elizabeth Klopfer, his own girlfriend. Though she couldn't believe the man she loved could be a monster, her suspicion planted the seed that would ultimately lead to his downfall. On a chilly November day, 18-year-old Carol DeRanche drove her maroon Camaro to the Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah. As she browsed the aisles, a well-dressed man approached her, introducing himself as Officer Roseland. He told her that someone had tried to break into her car and asked if she would accompany him to check if anything was missing. Trusting the man's badge and polite demeanor, Carol followed him back to the parking lot. Everything at her car appeared completely normal. No signs of damage or disturbance. Yet, despite the lack of any real concern, the officer insisted she needed to come with him to the station to file a report and help identify the suspect. As they approached his vehicle, Carol noticed something strange. It wasn't a police car, but a tan Volkswagen Beetle. Despite her growing unease, she got into the car. After driving for a few minutes, the man abruptly pulled into the parking lot of an elementary school. Without warning, he grabbed Carol's arm and snapped a handcuff onto her wrist. But in his haste, the cuff wasn't attached to anything. Realizing she was in grave danger, Carol fought back, kicking and screaming. In the struggle, the man pulled out a crowbar and tried to hit her, but Carol managed to block the blows with her arms. Carol made a desperate attempt to escape. She threw open the door and jumped out of the car, screaming for help. A couple driving by witnessed the chaotic scene and quickly pulled over to assist. In the confusion, Carol seized the opportunity to escape. Heart racing and filled with fear, she rushed straight to the police to report her terrifying encounter. She described the man, his car, and the fake officer's badge. Unbeknownst to Carol, she had just escaped from one of America's most dangerous serial killers. As night fell over Salt Lake City, Officer Bob Hayward sat alone in his cruiser in front of his home, trying to shake off the exhaustion of a long shift. The quiet offered a rare moment of peace until the low hum of an engine pierced the stillness. A tan Volkswagen Beetle crawled past, its headlights off. Hayward's instincts flared. Something wasn't right. The Beetle parked in front of Hayward's neighbor's house. The owners were away, leaving their 2 teenage daughters home alone. Instinctively, Hayward switched on his car's high beams to get a clearer look at the vehicle's license plate. The sudden brightness startled the driver, who immediately sped off. Hayward, now suspicious, decided to follow the car. As the Beetle raced through the quiet residential streets, the driver blew through several stop signs. Determined not to let the suspect escape, Hayward hit his lights and wailers, and after a brief chase, the Beetle finally pulled into an abandoned gas station and came to a stop. The driver, a man in his 20s with shoulder-length dark hair, got out with his hands up. The man claimed he was a lost college student who had been watching the towering inferno at a local drive-in theater, but something didn't sit right with Hayward. A quick check confirmed his suspicions. The movie hadn't been showing that night. Searching for clues, Hayward decided to inspect the man's car. Inside, something immediately caught his attention. The passenger seat was missing, replaced by an open bag containing a ski mask, crowbar, ice pick, rope, wire, trash bags, and other disturbing items. In the trunk, Hayward found a pair of handcuffs. These items suggested something far more sinister than burglary. Hayward arrested the man for evading an officer, but because there was no solid evidence of a crime beyond the tools found, the man, whose name was Ted Bundy, was released on bail the next day. Despite the lack of evidence, Hayward had a gut feeling that Bundy was up to no good, and it wasn't long before his instincts would prove correct. Bundy's brush with the law wasn't forgotten. Officer Hayward discussed the strange incident with his brother, Captain Pete Hayward, a homicide detective in Salt Lake City. When investigators at the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office heard about the tan Volkswagen and the strange items found inside, they couldn't ignore a chilling coincidence. It all matched the description Carol DeRanche had given months earlier, when she narrowly escaped an abduction by a man driving a tan Volkswagen. The connection was unmistakable. The detectives decided to take the next step. They needed Carol to identify Bundy. Carol DeRanche, still shaken from her near-death experience, was summoned to the station. The air was tense as she was led into a small, dimly lit room. On the other side of a one-way mirror stood a lineup of 8 men, each instructed to remain still. The men were diverse in appearance, but one stood out immediately. Without hesitation, Carol's heart raced as her eyes locked on him. The man who had tried to take her. The man who had lured her into his car. It was the same face, the same cold smile that had haunted her since that terrifying day. It was Ted Bundy. The moment she identified him, the case was sealed. Bundy was arrested once again, but this time it wasn't for a minor traffic violation or fleeing an officer. This time, the charge was attempted kidnapping. The courtroom was packed on February 23, 1976, the air thick with anticipation. Ted Bundy entered confidently, his boyish charm and composed demeanor masking the monstrous acts he was accused of. This time, however, the weight of evidence was undeniable. The star witness, Carol DeRanche, took the stand and recounted the terrifying details of her near abduction, her voice unwavering as she described escaping the handcuffs Bundy had clasped around her wrists. In the shadows of the court, the jury listened intently, eyes flicking between DeRanche and Bundy. It wasn't just her testimony that sealed his fate. Investigators had found handcuffs, a crowbar, and other disturbing items in Bundy's car, further implicating him in the attempt. Despite Bundy's protests and his unwavering self-assurance, the gavel came down hard. Guilty. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison. Though Bundy had been caught and convicted, this trial was only the beginning. Beneath the surface, the tangled web of his true horrors was only starting to unravel. Behind the cold, impassive walls of his prison cell, Ted Bundy likely believed he still had control over his fate, over the narrative. But outside, investigators were working relentlessly to pull at the threads of his dark past. One thread led back to the frozen January night of 1975, when Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse, vanished from the cozy warmth of a Colorado ski resort. Her body had been discovered weeks later in a snowbank, the brutal evidence of her murder chilling even the most seasoned detectives. Though her killer had slipped through their grasp back then, time had a way of closing in on Bundy. The authorities began connecting the dots. Witness sightings of Bundy at the Wildwood Inn, where Campbell was last seen, his infamous Volkswagen Beetle spotted near the resort, and travel records placing him in Colorado during her disappearance. Piece by piece, the puzzle was falling into place. On October 22, 1976, armed with these grim revelations, investigators charged Bundy with Karen Campbell's murder. What had begun as a case of attempted kidnapping had now spiraled into something far more sinister. Bundy's mask of normalcy was slipping, and soon, the world would see the full extent of his evil. Ted Bundy's charm was beginning to wear thin under the weight of new charges. Colorado investigators, determined to tie him to Karen Campbell's murder, finally caught up with him. In January 1977, the case was formalized, and Bundy was extradited to Aspen. Chains clinked around his wrists and ankles as he was flown from Utah to the snowy peaks of the Rockies. But for Bundy, this wasn't the end. Aspen wasn't just a courtroom, it was the perfect stage for his next move, the beginning of his most daring plans yet. Ted Bundy's trial for the murder of Karen Campbell was set to take place. Ever the cunning manipulator, Bundy chose to represent himself in court, granting him more freedom than the average inmate. This decision allowed him to visit the law library in the courthouse without being shackled or handcuffed, and he made the most of his opportunity. As Bundy's trial progressed, he seized an unexpected chance during a recess. When his guard stepped into the hallway for a cigarette, Bundy found himself alone in the second-floor law library. It was a sunny day with a clear blue sky when Bundy jumped from the second-story window. The fall was hard, but he quickly regained his footing, sprinting across the street, over a fence, and into an alleyway. From there, he made a beeline for the mountains surrounding Aspen. Bundy had meticulously planned his escape for weeks. He practiced jumping from his bunk bed to strengthen his ankles, rehearsed his exact escape route, and even wore a second layer of clothes under his courtroom outfit. He had also gotten a haircut and shaved his beard to alter his appearance. By the time the guards realized he was missing, 10 minutes had already passed, and Bundy had disappeared into the wilderness. The police quickly set up roadblocks, sent bloodhounds into the mountains, instructed residents to lock their doors, and launched a massive manhunt involving 150 officers and helicopters. The media quickly covered the escape, but despite their extensive efforts, Bundy managed to evade capture. Alone in the mountains, Bundy had nothing with him. No money, no food, no plan. Only a light shirt, pants, and a map of the area that had been used during the trial. He hiked up the hills and, by nightfall, had managed to cross Aspen Mountain. The next morning was cold and rainy. Instead of wandering further south, he tracked back and found a small cabin where he spent the night. On the third day, Bundy left the cabin with better supplies, some food, warm clothes, and some suggest even a rifle. However, as the FBI joined the manhunt, bringing in helicopters, Bundy quickly became disoriented despite having the map. When a rainstorm hit, he lost his bearings even more. The cold took its toll, and he eventually found himself walking in circles, ending up back at the cabin. There, he discovered tracks from the search party. They were onto him. For 5 grueling days, Ted Bundy hiked through the rugged hills of Colorado, his ankles swollen and his food supply dwindling. Eventually, he found himself back in Aspen, desperate for a vehicle to aid his escape. At a local golf course, he discovered an old Cadillac with the keys still inside. However, shortly after hitting the road, 2 police officers spotted the car weaving erratically. Assuming they were dealing with a drunk driver, they pulled the driver over, only to find a sober yet weak Ted Bundy behind the wheel. He had lost over 20 pounds, struggled to steer, and bore a bandaged nose. But despite his altered appearance, the officers recognized him immediately. Just 2 blocks from where he had leaped out of a window days earlier, Bundy was arrested once more. Back in custody, Bundy now faced additional charges for escape and was required to wear shackles and handcuffs during court appearances. Yet, this did little to deter him. Bundy was already plotting his next escape. After his first failed attempt in Aspen, he was transferred to the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. Determined to extend his freedom, he spent weeks studying the jail's layout. Bundy noticed that the ceiling of his cell had a weak light fixture that led to a crawl space above the prison. On the night of December 30th, 1977, with most of the jail staff off for the holidays and non-violent prisoners out on furlough, he saw his chance. He had previously obtained a hacksaw from another inmate and used it to cut a hole in the light fixture, just big enough for him to fit through. To prepare for this escape, he restricted his food intake, cleverly complaining about the meals to hide the fact that he was losing weight. When a guard brought Bundy a warm meal and left the cell, he didn't touch it. Instead, he stuffed books and files under his blanket to create the illusion of a sleeping body. He then hoisted himself into the small hole in the ceiling, breaking through into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife. After changing into street clothes from the jailer's closet, Bundy simply walked out the front door and into the frigid night. After stealing a car, Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs. But when the vehicle broke down in the mountains, a passing motorist kindly offered him a ride to Vail. From there, he caught a bus to Denver, where he boarded a morning flight to Chicago. By the time authorities in Glenwood Springs realized he was missing, more than 17 hours had already passed. Bundy was in Chicago, far beyond the reach of Colorado authorities. Under the alias Chris Hagen, Ted Bundy had been living quietly in a boarding house near Florida State University, just a few blocks from the Chi Omega sorority house in Tallahassee. Posing as a local student and lying low, he blended in seamlessly. However, on the night of January 15, 1978, his urge to kill resurfaced. As campus parties wound down and the nearby nightclub closed, the once bustling area grew quiet. Nita Neary returned from a date with her boyfriend and immediately sensed something was wrong. The front door of the Chi Omega house was unlocked. Inside, the house was eerily still, the silence broken only by the low hum of lights, when Nita heard a sudden thud from upstairs. Her breath caught as heavy footsteps approached from above. In an instant, a man barreled down the stairs, a piece of oak firewood clutched in his hand. His eyes were wild, his expression cold and disconnected. He rushed past her, flung open the door, and disappeared into the night. Shaken, Nita raced to wake her sorority sisters. Together, they hurried upstairs, where they were confronted with a gruesome scene. 4 women had been brutally attacked in their sleep. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were dead, while Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner lay critically injured but clinging to life. Blood streaked the walls, and the eerie quiet that followed the chaos hung heavily in the air. One terrifying detail haunted the survivors: the deep bite marks on Lisa Levy's body, a savage signature of the killer. The police arrived swiftly, but Bundy had already vanished into the night. Just 3 weeks after the Chi Omega murders, Bundy was still on the run, moving from town to town across Florida. Though several of his abduction attempts had failed, on the morning of February 9, 1978, his murderous spree continued, when his eyes settled on his next victim, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Kimberly, a student at Lake City Junior High, was hurrying across the rain-soaked schoolyard to retrieve her forgotten purse from a classroom. Watching like a predator from his stolen van, Bundy waited for the perfect moment. He signaled for her to come closer, luring her unknowingly into his trap. Despite frantic searches and desperate pleas for help, Kimberly was never seen alive again. Weeks later, her body was found in an abandoned shed, her young life brutally cut short by Bundy's escalating violence. On February 15, 1978, in Pensacola, Florida, Officer David Lee sat parked in a quiet neighborhood when he noticed an orange Volkswagen Beetle driving with its headlights off. A check of the license plate confirmed his suspicions. The vehicle was stolen. Lee activated his patrol lights and signaled the driver to pull over. Instead of stopping, the driver hit the gas, speeding away into the dark. Determined not to lose him, Lee gave chase. After a brief pursuit through the quiet streets of Pensacola, the Beetle screeched to a halt. Lee approached cautiously, his right hand on his holstered weapon. Bundy, who must have had a strange feeling of déjà vu at this point, decided not to play it safe this time. As Officer Lee attempted to cuff him, Bundy lashed out, hitting the officer in the face. Lee fired a warning shot, but Bundy fled. The officer pursued him, firing again, and Bundy collapsed to the ground. But it was a trick. When Lee approached, Bundy lunged at him, trying to grab the officer's gun. Lee struck him with a pistol, finally subduing and arresting him. At the station, Bundy continued to hide behind a false identity, refusing to reveal who he was. Despite being one of the most wanted men in America, the local police didn't immediately recognize him. Bundy had altered his appearance. The authorities tried to run his fingerprints, but back in the days, it took time for them to connect the prints with Bundy's known records. Days of questioning yielded no results, and Bundy stubbornly maintained his fake identity. Finally, Growing frustrated after days of interrogation, Bundy revealed his true identity. The gravity of the revelation hit the Pensacola police hard. They had captured Ted Bundy, the serial killer who had terrorized the nation, and this time, there would be no escape. Finally, on July 24, 1979, he faced charges for the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, along with the vicious assaults on Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner at the Chi Omega sorority house. The trial quickly became a media circus, capturing the nation's attention like never before. Ever the showman, Bundy chose to represent himself, relishing the chance to cross-examine witnesses and argue his own case. He used his charm and clever strategies to confuse the jury and sow doubt, but despite his courtroom theatrics, the overwhelming evidence against him couldn't be ignored. Forensic experts testified that bite marks found on Lisa Levy's body matched Bundy's teeth. This crucial evidence, along with eyewitnesses' key testimonies placing Bundy near the crime scene, sealed his fate. Exactly 1 week after his conviction, Bundy was back in court, but this time the stakes were final. The jury, without hesitation, declared him guilty on all counts, sealing his fate. The air in the courtroom was heavy with anticipation, the families of his victims barely breathing as they waited for the words they'd longed to hear. With quiet finality, the judge pronounced the sentence: death by electric chair. There would be no more escapes, no more tricks. For the first time, Bundy's charm and cunning had failed him, and the families could at last begin to feel a sense of justice. But it wasn't over yet. 6 months after his first conviction, Bundy faced his second trial, this time for the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Her innocent face had haunted the nation, a symbol of stolen youth and savage violence. As the prosecution laid out the horrifying details of her abduction, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. No one could look away. The evidence was damning, the narrative chilling. Kimberly had been lured, taken, and murdered in cold blood. The jury, shaken and resolute, swiftly delivered their verdict: guilty. Once again, Ted Bundy had been unmasked as the monster he truly was. A mere month after his conviction for the murder of Kimberly Leach, Bundy stood before the court once more. The courtroom buzzed with grim expectation. His fate had already been decided, but this time the finality felt heavier, more inescapable. The judge, eyes unwavering, sentenced Bundy to death for the second time. Ted Bundy, a name synonymous with horror and destruction, would never see the light of freedom again. If you've made it this far, we're definitely a match. Your support helps me keep creating in-depth reports like this every week, so don't forget to subscribe and like for more thrilling true crime stories. There's plenty more to come.